Welcome to the first episode of the new year for the weekly Ingest. My name is Jason Firch, and I'm joined here with our resident in-house expert, Josh Allen. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the SolarWinds attack. I think that's something that we haven't really touched upon since the exploit in the Orion platform came into news. What was that? Beginning of December. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, what's transpired in the last few months, talk a little bit about the techniques and what mitigating factors could have been taken as a response to this attack. So Josh, take it away.
Hey, thank you. So we're going to start off with just kind of this overview. I'm reading off of ZDNet here. The more we learn, the worse it looks, which is kind of the sentiment lately. It's SolarWinds. This did come out as you just mentioned a little bit later last year. I'm sure everybody heard about it, and it kind of dipped off the radar for a minute because there's been some other decidedly more important stuff going on. But while that's been going on, the researchers have been finding more and more to the scope of this breach, which includes some of the stuff that's been leaked out of the Department of Justice and some of these other federal departments, as well as other private companies. Another interesting thing that they're finding out of this was this one here. It's possible that the APT hackers have they've actually gotten a hold of the Microsoft software stack. They don't go into a whole lot of details of what that means, but it means, from what I see with the rest of this attack, is they're probably trying to do something very similar, which is sign their code, their malicious code, so that they can introduce it into the software supply chain and have people, update stuff with risks. And it's actually a really good thing to talk about right here. So how this originally came out was it was introduced into the supply chain after they compromised SolarWinds through various means that we're going to talk about today as well. But what they were able to do is they were able to introduce their malware and they're into the official Orion plugin code and sign it. And this was the big thing, was their ability to sign it as, authentic code means that as soon as you download this, it's not going to trigger any kind of security because it's already signed code. It's not going to be considered a signature, a risk signature. Then I'm going to look at it like that. For the most part, some things will still, but what's really interesting is you catch this by patching. So we've talked before about how patching is really critical, and it still is, but this is what we're dealing with APT, with software supply chain poisoning, is when you patch your systems. That's actually when you introduce the malware, and it only works if this supply chain is sufficiently poisoned that you've been able to sign the code, you can evade all of the all the detection software, all of the firewalls, everything like that. So they're calling this, again, Solar Burst. The malware itself is called Teardrop. Teardrop is something that's been introduced into multiple agencies. It seems to be the primary methodology of spread is this Teardrop, which we can also talk a little bit more about today. But it's definitely gotten bigger. It's impacted almost the entire federal government, a bunch of state governments, major corporations, national corporations. This one's really big. So in the actual US court records, they figured out that during the breach, they were able to access the judiciary's case management and electronic case file system called CMECF.
Can you zoom in just a little bit on that?
Sure, I can. How's that look?
That looks good.
Awesome. So the CMECF, this is the case management system. This is extremely sensitive data. This is the details of court cases, which I don't have to tell you can be extremely personal, extremely detailed. They can hold all kinds of data in there. It's again likely Russian origin. We already know that. So this is coming from Krebs on security, by the way. We know who Chris Krebs is, former director of CISA, pretty intelligent individual, very good source of information. So the problem here and here we go again, a second stage teardrop malware. So this malware is the main methodology in this attack, other than the Sunburst malicious software, which was part of the Orion package. We already have this open here. Of course, they don't tell you exactly, who's or what's here. That would be proprietary information, but this is pretty serious. The fact that they were able to not just compromise and get their malware into these systems, into the U.S. Department of Justice, but they were able to use their command and control to break into the Microsoft 365 system. They got access to the email servers, and once you have access to the email servers on any kind of federated enterprise, but really, with these federal systems, that Exchange server is kind of a central hub for information for, that holds everybody's backups too. PTS files, right, is a big thing. PST files. I don't know. Somebody's going to correct me on that one. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I had to mess with that, fortunately. So, but and a lot of that's cloudified too, but which is the 365. And still, once you get in there, I mean that it's OneDrive, it's everything. That's such deep access. So it's, and I think that's only really been made possible by the fact that they were able to sign their malware as legitimate code.
So before we jump into that, so you mentioned that it's a two-tiered attack, and I've even been reading information that that this attack has been ongoing far longer than we initially thought. So I believe once everything was discovered, about a month or so after the discovery, the formal communication was saying that it had been around potentially since the beginning of March 2020, sometime around that time frame. But they're even saying that it's extending past that now.
Yes, it's definitely longer than that. Last thing I read, and this is something I'll have to pull up, and we can cite this later, but I mean, they're looking at years now, but that's typical. This is an APT attack, and the P, I don't have to remind you, is persistence, advanced persistent threat. And persistence doesn't mean months or quarters. It literally means years. To pull off something like this, the start of the attack, it probably goes back 2, 3, maybe even longer years. They have to find, a weak link outside and slowly and quietly work their way into deeper and deeper into the system, and that absolutely takes time, and it takes really advanced techniques, hence APT, right? So no, I wouldn't be surprised if I mean, even if this goes back to 2015, if that was the initial deployment of some of this malware, it's possible that there was some critical strike modified malware in this. So, it would be safe to assume that the start of this attack, maybe the testing or the development of the tools used, go back at least as long as that kind of malware and software has been available.
Right. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in our security trends report, which you can get on our website. That there's a growing threat in supply chain attacks as a method, like you were saying, to attack the weakest link in that supply chain. You may not be able to breach a bank, but if you target some of the suppliers that don't have as robust security controls or framework requirements through compliance that a bank might have, that's your entry point while bypassing all of those other controls that, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of security controls. It's just a way around it.
Yeah, and we talked about that before. This is evidence, one of the, like I said, the cyber cold war, right, of getting better and more advanced, but also exactly what you said. Banks, governments have spent a lot of time and money and resources building really robust security for their own systems, because they're the ones who are responsible for it, right? They have to get the PCI audits, they have to get the CMMC audits, they have to get all this stuff. And so they have to worry about all that. And what happens is you can't really worry about your vendor stuff as much. I mean, you should, but vendor assessments exist, and people do a pretty good job with vendor assessments, but I don't think a vendor assessment would have ever caught. Look at all the people who trust SolarWinds, and why wouldn't you trust SolarWinds? I mean, it's like saying I don't trust HP almost. Some people think, I guess, SolarWinds is obscure, but I've been hearing SolarWinds since forever. I don't know.
Yeah, I heard when it was reported more mainstream, they literally use the word obscure software platform.
Obscure software platform.
This is insane. Like I mean, I'm not a super technical person, but I worked long enough at an MSP to know that SolarWinds is a lifeline for a lot of these organizations just to monitor things. So, yeah, that's a good point. You're
Yeah,
you're going to the actual systems that were compromised.
I
Um,
can't find it on here. It's New York Times. It's a little wordy as usual. But yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's more than this. They've got yes, tens, possibly even to the hundreds of thousands of total customers and clients based,
yeah,
all these different systems. So yeah,
real obscure.
yeah, maybe somebody hasn't heard of them, sure, but that's a security company doing a good
Yeah,
job. Also,
yeah,
I've worked for companies that people are like, who the heck is that? And then I name some of our customers, are like, wow. So that's just
Well,
that's just the field.
I'll just leave it at this, and then we can move on. I think that my prediction is that as supply chain attacks continue to grow in frequency, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on companies to adhere to at least some level of good security hygiene, some good practices. I don't know what that baseline will be. I think CMMC will inform a lot of that. Um, for now for DoD suppliers, but I think that that's going to be a start of a framework that may become more of a universal US policy that if you do business with an organization, you have to have some minimum threshold of security controls in place based on your needs, or based on the data that you collect and store. Um,
Yep.
I think it's just going to be a cost of doing business. Just instead of purchasing a office space for your workers, they're now working remote. Now you take that money and reinvest it into security.
Yeah, if you haven't taken all of the dollars you're spending on cybersecurity and put that in your bucket of cost of doing business, you're wrong. I'm just going to say that now. In 2021, at this point, it is a cost of doing business. It's just as important as desks, as security guards, as plumbing in your building, as building the product. Is you have to be secure, and this is why.
All right, let's move
So
on to the next bit here.
yeah, so something you mentioned that we're going to get back to in a minute here is prevention on this kind of thing, especially because this came from a trusted vendor. Here's some more of what was used, just to cover it. This is, as they investigate the breach, there's more scope. We know they use this malware. They managed to get around the MFA as well by compromising their security server, which was pretty impressive, very cool. They also use some pretty basic techniques. Password guessing. Password guessing is surprisingly still very effective. Password spraying was also used. You know, it catches default accounts, it catches accounts that have been compromised previously, catches reused accounts. It's just brute forcing. And the fact that it worked here shows that nobody is safe from brute forcing, ever.
Mm-hmm.
We can make it harder. It has gotten a lot harder, but especially in these ones, this is kind of a human error because for the most part, if you can guess or spray a password, it's because it's been compromised and
Mm-hmm.
reused. And that means that the human behind that password, or the administrative controls around that password did not do a good job of, recycling, implementing good complexity, things like this.
Yeah. And for people that don't know, at least on the brute forcing side, it doesn't take a lot of resources and it's not very costly to spin up a
It's cheaper in
server
the cloud.
in AWS, right, for the resources to have a simple machine run 100,000 passwords a second. Like you're talking a couple $100 to run that 24 hours a day. So if the value of that target is worth it, it's not cost prohibitive to actually brute force these attacks. So it just wanted to make sure that people are aware that it's something that is this day and age, your passwords, they need to be in good order. You can't be reusing them across all your different platforms. And I think to that point, Google has some good mechanisms in place. If you store your passwords through Chrome, they'll tell you if it's been compromised, and then you can go in
Yep.
and make sure you change them. But sorry to
Dashlane. Oh no, I was gonna say yeah.
digress there.
Yeah. Dashlane does that, and some of the other ones are starting to do that. Another topic probably for later is that Titan security module we talked about has
Mm-hmm.
actually been compromised. So we can.
Wow.
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
All right. So moving on from password spraying again. Brute forcing still works. And yeah, the cloud thing is great. For a while there, we were at this kind of point where there was no cloud and you had to buy, 40 GPUs to break these complex passwords. And these days, you can do it in a couple days online, no problem. We're gonna pass this one. I want to talk about that one. This is the okay. So this is Teardrop. Let's talk about Teardrop real quick before jumping in, because I want to talk about what it does. So this is the second stage of malware. The first one is Sunburst. It's a backdoor, and then they drop Teardrop in here. This is what allows Teardrop. Okay, Beacon is the Cobalt Strike malware. Teardrop, I think, is a modification of Beacon. This is what I was talking about, where this attack is at least that old, right? Go back to Cobalt Strike. Let me see, where was it? Okay, right here. So Teardrop sets up the command and control domains. It's got hard-coded machine and domain attacks. So it's actually selective right here. So you can see that what they've done is they've gotten in using Sunburst in the back door, and then using Teardrop, they're actually hard coding their targets and dropping that in, because it needs to be, it seems like they need to slipstream it into the repository. So rather than controlling it, which could get you caught, they just build something that's, going to drop and it's going to run and target the targets on its own. This is a big one. So the command and control traffic masquerades as a legitimate Orion improvement program. So when this is deployed out to customers and this thing is sending their breached data back up, nothing's looking at this because of this. It's just, yep, Orion's online. This is the, SolarWinds, all good. And yeah, hides in plain sight using fake variable names. So that's kind of the crazy thing about this. Here's the DLL, SolarWinds Orion Core Business Layer.dll, and it's signed. And this is awesome. They actually provide you the serial number. So this is one of your IOCs. If you're doing threat hunting, if you're trying to find out if you've been breached, look for this certificate serial number, look for this DLL, and look for that hotfix version, this one, right? You can find these on FireEye, and we'll link these up here too. But that's going to be your main indicator of compromise right there. So what do we do about this? What would have stopped this? Patching wouldn't have stopped this. Patching introduced this. Firewalls won't help. IDSs won't help. IPSs won't help, because everything is masquerading as legitimate traffic. So, it's kind of a scary situation. It's like you have a trusted vendor who you've reviewed, who's been trusted for many years, who's suddenly been poisoned. Zerotrust. This really is, I think, where security needs to be going, and it is starting to go on the enterprise side. And so it's a concept, it's an architecture. You really do have to build an architecture around this. So it does take effort for an organization to go to Zerotrust, especially if they've been bad with security up until now, put it that way. Something that we were doing at NOV, we just got started on. So it's very interesting. It's a lot of work to implement this, but man, is it powerful.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that, and maybe you'll get to this in a second. Like, how feasible is something like this for an SMB to implement?
For an SMB, honestly, I think it's easier the smaller you are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, really, because it's around. Okay, so it's RBAC, it's Active Directory, it's permissions. It's a lot of administrative stuff. So it's depends on how good your administrators are and how big the team is and how granular you are right now. And so one of the big tenets of Zerotrust is trying to make it less granular. So RBAC is awesome. AD is awesome for Zerotrust. Rather than giving everybody all these little individual rights, you create only white lists of access, and you put people into big blocks and groups, right? Like your finance people, what do they need access to? Almost nothing, probably. They need the finance server, if you have one. They're going to need their laptops and workstations and whatever software it's there, but that's it. They're not going to need to access any of the other systems. So you put them in something that only gives them explicit access to those that they need. That's kind of the core architecture of Zerotrust, but it goes beyond that, because it also has to align with the data. And this is going to be an important thing here, DAAS, D-A-A-S, which stands for Data, Assets, Applications, and Services. It's crown jewels. So what you have to do is you have to define your crown jewels, define your DOS, define the surface that if everything goes wrong, you cannot allow anyone to access that because that's, your proprietary information. So then you're creating a perimeter around that internally as well as externally. So you don't allow anybody in your organization to access it unless they have an explicit need to. This is something that the government kind of already does with their whole need to know access. Think of it like data classification. This is effectively what Zerotrust is doing to your data.
Yeah, I mean, from more of like a business ops perspective, like if you have someone who's in charge of HR, you don't need to have someone in the finance or marketing departments having access to that information. And that in that case, it's sensitive internal employee information that you don't want other employees to access. And similar with the financial teams, you don't want the HR teams to have access to financial information.
Yep. So the next step, now that covers the people, right? And something a lot of places kind of already get is the people, but now the software is another one. This is one that often gets overlooked, is allowing your software to be too talkative, too much access is something that allows these SolarWinds types attacks to be as effective as they are, right? Because I know somebody who works at a major corporation, a federated corporation, who has SolarWinds, had Orion, and did patch to this version. So they had to take it offline. And what ultimately happened is when they looked at where it was configured, it was sitting in a flat network. And this SolarWinds server had access to everything, right? And it had a service account that was nearly a global admin because it needed to do a lot of stuff. And you trust SolarWinds, right? But the problem is when SolarWinds got compromised, it now has all that access you already gave it, and that is not a unique scenario. That is very common because we trust these things. So the next step is layer 7. You need to segment out your traffic, your network traffic, your internet traffic, using a segmentation gateway, a next generation firewall. NG-WAFs are a big, or NG firewalls, NGFW, but also NG-WAFs are part of that next gen. They're, just another iteration in the firewall technology. So they're traffic aware, they're signature aware, they're session aware. That's a big one too. So they're aware of all the things, so they know exactly who and what is connecting to who and what, and whether or not it's allowed to do that. So on an NG-WAF or a segmentation gateway, which you can build in the cloud as well, they have these in AWS, Azure, all that. You're configuring these things to say, okay, this is the only system and the only with this type of traffic on this user account from this server that is allowed to communicate with the data I have here, with the DOS, with the DAS. That's effectively how Zerotrust works. You take your crown jewels and you say, okay, this is the explicit, smallest possible list you can make of access and what kind of access they have. And everybody else does not get access. That's building it.
Right, and you're essentially you're mitigating the someone to move laterally and escalate their privileges across the network.
Yeah. This way, if anybody is compromised, the only what do they call it? They call it splash zone, right? Is one of the like splash damage, right? So the splash zone gets smaller because they don't have as much access. If they compromise your AD server and they have global admin, the splash zone is your entire network.
Right.
But if they, if somebody, in some, a contractor or the construction field,
or something,
they fish a user. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, that's what I was trying to get to. Yeah, then only the access that person has is at risk. Generally, I mean, there's ways around that too, but at first, that's it. Like the moment they get access to your system, what can they touch? If it's everything, then your security measures are pointless beyond that.
We're talking mitigation, not prevention.
Well, Zerotrust is meant to be a form of prevention. I hate saying prevention because nothing prevents, but it's in terms of prevention, mitigation, and reaction, this is a prevention technique.
I see. Okay.
and a mitigation. It makes the attacks smaller, but it also helps prevent the attacks from happening. So it's both, I guess, to be
Okay.
yeah.
To some level of degree. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you were asking about SMB. So Zerotrust is flexible. It's not. This is what I like about Zerotrust. It's a framework, but it's not a framework. It's more like a state of mind. So NIST is a framework, right? It says you have to do these explicit things, and it doesn't matter what size you are. NIST is NIST. Zerotrust isn't that rigid. It's really about following that, like the philosophy and the concept of it, of whatever your organization is, fine, but figure out what's most important that cannot be compromised and only allow the access you can. And you, the big thing is considering all traffic. Like this has to be at a traffic level. Don't think of it as employees, as systems, as just traffic. What traffic can go here and what traffic can go out of here, bottom line. And I think that that's, that is going to be really effective going forward, because up until now, it's generally been, it has been role based. This is more traffic role based, right? It's okay. We think about, like I just said, finance departments, sales departments, which is your classic Active Directory tree, right?
Right. You're just grouping them up. Yeah.
But the reality is nobody's really doing it that way. Well, I don't want to say that. That's not going to become the primary model anymore. It's already starting to fade away with the advent of cloud, especially. When you've got people accessing stuff remotely from public servers, from the cloud, from home, you really can't do that Active Directory tree thing anymore. The RBAC is too hard, and that's where Zerotrust is. You forget about who it is, and you only focus on what traffic's allowed to go in and out of your DAS. So here's just a quick overview of what we just talked about. And again, I'm getting this from Palo Alto Networks, which, by the way, are awesome at Zerotrust. Worked with them quite a bit over at NOV, and they were really cool guys. They're really smart. They came out, we talked to them, hung out for a while. The super cool people at Palo Alto. So figure out what it is. Here's an important one. So you have to have network maps. You must have network maps. You must have architecture drawings. You cannot do this if you don't know where your traffic is going. So you have to do asset inventory, and you have to know what they're all connected to, which means you've got to have, some CCNA guys who are paying attention at your company.
Honestly, you should have that no matter what.
Yes.
Talk to your vendor if you have a vendor. Talk to your internal team. That should be like table stakes.
Yeah, I mean, and that goes beyond security. That's business efficiency.
Yeah.
If you don't have somebody optimizing your network or your business is not as running as well as it can be. So you should have a network person, and you should pay him well and be nice to him and ask him for network maps. Because
the help desk.
Yes, ask that guy for the Visio drawings. So then it's building it, which is what we talked about. Is okay. Now we've got it mapped out. It's really about trying to delete as many lines going into your identified systems in the network drawing as you can. Right. So you want to have as few pipelines in there. That way, it's easier to administrate too. There's so many reasons for it. It's a lot to talk about. That's why I said we could talk about Zerotrust for hours. But it makes it easier to manage too, because hey, if we only have one single connection to your crown jewels, then guess what? You only have to monitor that one single connection to see if something is accessing your crown jewels, right? So it makes it easier on your security team. We know where to deploy it, and we know exactly what to expect, because it's always this connection and it's always this traffic. And so an anomaly becomes really obvious, sticks out like a sore thumb. People trying to access things that they're not supposed to, like, well, what? Hey, you don't, people before, when people could just access stuff, you'd never know if they were necessarily, even if you're logging it, right? Because they're clicking around. But once people start having to get permission to look at things, you can start to see kind of what's going on in your organization, right? Who's doing what. In bigger organizations, this could be an indicator of somebody who's trying to, spy or steal stuff from you. Or it could be an indicator of somebody whose account has been compromised if you see somebody from a department who's not supposed to be accessing this information, or you see a software program like Orion accessing this information, and it's never supposed to look at that, right? So this is a huge thing here.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of organizations, especially when they're deploying and implementing a SIM to log and ingest all that traffic, they don't understand the nuances behind it. It's like, yeah, we could take a look at all of foreign all of traffic coming from a foreign IP, but what's the point in doing that?
Right.
Here at least you're getting a granular look. The data streams are pretty well defined and clear, and then you can have your threat intel teams or whomever is overseeing that program makes their job easier, and
Yep.
they're focusing more of their time thinking about the questions that you just posed, like or the scenarios that you just posed of and determining whether or not that traffic is malicious or not, or what their intent is behind it, versus just trying to get a handle on the information flow.
Yeah. And hey, you're talking about red teaming, and that's a really good point to this. You have to test this architecture, and so you have to do pen tests. So you don't know if your zero trust is working if you're not doing those red team exercises
Mhm.
trying to access it. Um, so that's all in the architecture. This is a big one too. Is number 4 here is create a zero trust policy, and that's your people policies, right? That's your acceptable use policy, password policies, everything has to be zero trust too. Make sure your passwords are complex. You have to write a policy for zero trust. You have to write a policy that says access to, the identified DAS traffic is limited to blah blah blah. That has to be a policy, because otherwise, you know, when people are going to try to make things work better, they're just going to plug it all in, and you're going to lose your zero trust as soon as that starts happening. Right? So you have to, that's your framework for what you can build. Once you've already built it, you have to keep people from destroying it, going around it, or accidentally messing it up by using these policies. um, don't want to dive too much into that. We know what policies are. This is the last step that's also important. Every 5, you have to do all 5 of these. And this one's just as important as all the others, is monitoring and maintaining it. So you've built it, you've trained everyone on it, you've put a new policy, you've got it all mapped out. Now you have to ensure that it's working. You have to make sure people aren't trying to get access to it. You have to make sure, your policies are working, because it could be you wrote all this stuff and then you're monitoring it and you go, wait, how did this thing get access? And you realized it didn't circumvent anything. You didn't put the controls in place to prevent that, right? So it's an iterative, it's constantly, it's not a set and forget kind of thing. Zero trust requires your whole security team to be doing it all the time. Monitoring and maintenance is another really big responsibility. You can take an entire team and, this is what a SOC does. This is a huge part of it right here, is security operations center work, is watching the SIM, watching the firewall logs, reacting to IOCs, doing breach reports if anything does get in there, monitoring that cyber kill chain and ensuring that all of your zero trust stuff is working. Um, and then any attempts, like if Orion were blasting your DAS with, attempts to pull out gigs of files, your SOC should be able to see that, react to that, if you've done a good job with your policies and your architecture,
Mhm.
and giving them that visibility. This is something that this is where MDR is a kind of new one, monitor managed detection and response. That something that Alert Logic does. It's a huge thing that they do there. So they deploy um, they deploy appliances into your architecture, and this is kind of where this is SaaS, right? Security as a
Mhm.
service. This is where the partnership thing kind of comes in. So we talked about this with the SOC article, is not everybody can afford to do this part. Not everybody can afford to have a SOC, especially an SMB, right? You
Right.
you can hire another 50% of the company just to do this part. No, pay a subscription fee, right? And have somebody else do it for you. As long as you've built the architecture properly and you've deployed your SaaS solutions architecture properly, you're going to have a lot of success here. So every one of these steps, super important. Um, and if you're an SMB who's looking to do this on your own, you're just like, what the heck? I would direct you here to Palo Alto. These guys are really good with this stuff. They're not the only ones, but I trust them. I like working with them.
Or reach out to a vendor
Yep.
if you're really unsure and you don't have the expertise in house. Reach out to a vendor and see if you can form a partnership. I mean, I think
Yep.
that's one of the best ways to, especially if you're a smaller organization that can't afford the internal resources. Just reach
Right.
out, talk to professionals, and gauge whether or not it's something that they're able to help you out with. I mean, this is something I think most security companies in this day and age would be able to assist with. Maybe not the full blown SOC as a service. I mean, not all organizations have that as a service offering, but at least getting you to the policy side of things, to the architecture of things, just as a consultant to help guide these initiatives.
Yeah, so something that PurpleSec does is the red teaming exercises as well, which is testing out this. You have to make sure you're pen testing your Zerotrust, make sure it's working. Looking at probably building on those offerings too through PurpleSec as well. One of the big things that I think people are going to need help with, other than this is the obvious, right? Because it takes a lot of manpower, and there are services around that now. But actually building it and building the policy. If you're an SMB, this is, and you just don't have the IT staff, you don't have a CISO, you don't have a whole thing like this. This is a great thing that vendors, like PurpleSec and competitors can do is consult on this and actually do, like what we do, right? When we do a test, when we do a pen test, when we do a vulnerability scan, we put together this whole risk report that includes these types of things in the recommendations. And if you're a cybersecurity company who's making recommendations to your vendors or to your clients rather, that this is really how you give them the service. This is something that we're trying to do, is not just tell you like, oh, here's all the stuff that's wrong, but patch these systems, build zero trust. This is the type of stuff I love to put into my recommendations whenever I've done any kind of cybersecurity work, right, on a client. Is how can you prevent this better in the future? Is not just by deploying expensive stuff, but consider altering these user permissions. The administrative controls are a huge part of it. Those are usually what aren't set up properly, right? People have security tools, but people aren't very good at policy and administrative controls. And I think people need help with that. And I think offering that as a service is, it's great for us. We can talk about this. So obviously,
Yeah, right. I think the bottom line with that is don't rely solely on the tools. There's so much more nuance involved in the whole scope of securing an organization.
It's
Um,
PPT. It's all of it.
it's all of it combined. Yeah, people, processes, and technology. And if you're only relying on the tool sets, then you are more often than not just kind of wasting money.
Right. It's that whole thing. You can deploy this expensive system, but if if it's admin,
The password, yeah. Okay, so zero trust is a really interesting concept, and if it were to have been deployed in a more strict fashion, it may have been a prevention or at the very least a mitigating factor in the entire SolarWinds attack. Is that what you kind of conclude so far based on the evidence provided?
definitely. It's yeah, because really was about SolarWinds or Orion being trusted, and
Hmm.
so when a trusted platform gets poisoned, it's really not a lot you can do about that on their end. All you can do is limit the access that those software systems you've have. Also, external remote services. This is a huge part of zero trust, but it's a really big part of everything. Is you need to trust these a lot less. It's external stuff. There's a lot of things that are just
Yeah.
open. You install a system, it opens up a bunch of services, and you just cool. I
And
think this, you go with the default, right? Don't leave the default.
this is something you need to discuss with the vendor before you engage with them.
Yes.
If you're doing any type of vendor analysis, you're reaching out to a handful of vendors to deploy whatever. Doesn't matter what the software is. If it's integrated somewhere within your systems, you need to understand exactly how that platform is accessing and relaying information with other um, aspects of your network. You want to have it very clearly defined in the contract. And if there is something that gives you pause for hesitation, then you need to address it before you sign any agreements. I can't stress that enough.
Yeah, something I was in charge of previously working at A few places, NOV, DoD. Doing the third-party vendor assessment, one big part of it was, show us your policies, show us your frameworks, but show me the data flow diagram of how my data flows through your system once we're subscribed.
Mhm.
That is very telling. Because they'll talk about, oh, we're safe when we do all this and this and that. But then once you get the data flow diagram, you can actually see, we're like, okay, well, what is this system over here? And they're like, oh, well, that's our third party vendors access system where who we partner with can get metrics on our customers. Okay, so now we're introducing a third party, right? A
Yeah,
fourth party.
exactly.
So yeah,
Be
that's the
wary.
kind of stuff. Yes, be wary. And here I wanted to highlight this as we're talking about it from MITRE ATT&CK. This applies to more than just APT, but this is one of the big things here, and this is what Zerotrust looks at. Access to valid accounts to use the service is often a requirement, which could be attained through credential farming, obtaining credentials from users after compromising the enterprise network, phishing. Access to remote services may be used as a redundant or persistent access mechanism during an operation. So what this is saying is, if you've plugged in a bunch of things that are services like Orion, like whatever, like all these other things, and they're flying off to their home servers, every single one of those things could potentially be used as a backup command and control server or access point for an APT to exfiltrate your data or send down malware. So if those things all have powerful administrative access, if they are compromised, you've given the malicious actors the same access. And that's a really big part of zero trust. Don't just don't let the traffic touch anything it doesn't need to touch. And really focusing on the traffic, man. I want to kind of hammer that point home. It's tough though. It is hard.
Yeah.
A lot of places don't have Visio drawings of every single, especially, they'll put one up when they move to a colo, but if it's been 3 years since you moved into a colo, and you're a major company, is that accurate? There might be new
Right.
stuff in there, right? So you have to keep up on top of that.
At least an annual or biannual assessment just to
Yeah.
update documentation.
I
And
don't
if,
I don't see many people do that with their network.
yeah. Well, I mean, documentation in general, like the management of it is
Boring.
it's not, it's a boring job. Yeah, it's the best way to put it. It's a boring job and no one really wants to do it, and it can be very time consuming too, depending on the size of the organization. So
I'm one of
um
those crazy people who loves that. That's
oh well, you like order, right? Find the chaos and order it.
Well,
um
I don't like putting out fires. I like building fireproof buildings. The way I
that's
like
a
to put
better way
it.
to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, because the policy is a big part of it. And yeah, it's also really frustrating to me as an IT security, a cybersecurity individual when I'm trying to implement zero trust, right? I'm trying to investigate an IOC, something like this, and I run into the problem of I found a complicated network setup architecture here and it's not documented, and the guy who built it is long gone, and
Hmm.
the new guy we hired doesn't know, and so it can get really hard. So keeping those things clean is a huge cybersecurity implementation, or in sorry, I meant to say implementation. uh, I lost what I was trying to say, but implications for
uh,
security. um, because at the core level, that layer 3 is where all the stuff's happening, right?
hmm.
On the pipes in the electrons. So
All right, well, Josh, thanks for talking this through. Really, as the story evolves further, I'm sure that there's going to be more information coming out. I see it streaming in on a daily basis, but throughout the next couple weeks and maybe even years, we're going to learn more and more about this, about SolarWinds. But I do like the fact that we're tying in some prevention and mitigation techniques in there as well for organizations just as a whole. So is there anything else that you'd like to, kind of put your final words to on this?
Yeah, I think the last thing I want to talk about, really, and just is sort of preface that we're going to be getting into more and more of these things, and what we're covering is kind of defense in depth, and that's what all this stuff is. So, patching is one layer, Zerotrust is another layer, testing is another layer. That's defense in depth. So really, it's about stacking and figuring out what works for you. And so we'll talk more about it, because I'm also positive we're going to start seeing a bunch of other companies who've been compromised coming out of this. We've been focusing on the federal government, but they have a lot of private companies. So we'll see as
Yeah,
those investigations come to a close.
it's a good point, and then we can tie that into our breach report. All right,
Absolutely.
Josh. Thank you as always. Looking forward to next week's episode.
Yeah, sounds good, man. I will see you there.